Okay, so what I wanted to talk about is essentially having a mini interview with Jen, who I consider my mentor in philosophy and yoga. I just have a couple of questions here that will maybe branch off into more discussion and more context for the experimental metaphysics podcast, their experience that we've done. I'll just pull that up real quick. Okay, so the first question is, Jen, what is metaphysics to you, and how does it diverge from the commonplace usage of the term in philosophy?
I'm not sure that there is a commonplace usage, because for there to be a commonplace usage for a term, the like a statistically significant number of randomly questioned plebs should converge on a multi-maxima possessing distribution, like a meaningful histogram type deal. I would venture hazard to guess that the majority of plebs that you petitioned would not have a definition. And that's fine. Like, a lot of people don't have definitions for words. I don't know if you agree with that, but I mean, if you want to test that out and see.
Yeah, I mean, I know. I guess I'm kind of being shady because my question.
If there is one. It's
right.
Crystals. You know those people with the like hippie clothing and the crystals? Metaphysics is associated with that as a like pseudo-scientific but not physics level of certainty associated with like westernized version of mystical stuff embodied by smelling like that stuff that you burn to cover up the smell of weed and
sage,
whatnot. Yeah, that's the one.
Okay, so what's
the point is that metaphysics, let's say we sweep that definition of dirty hippies aside, because the crystals people don't really give a shit about philosophy in the sense that we're talking about here. Metaphysics, I would argue, when you're looking at philosophy, that every school of philosophy has their own metaphysics, and it's just the definition that you get on the internet.
Okay, so yeah, I was
foundational branch of philosophy that studies the fundamental nature of reality, existence, and the universe. So arguably, every school of philosophy does that, but in their own way. And having a different way of doing metaphysics can be argued to be itself how philosophical schools are distinguished.
Right. Couldn't it also be how you invoke metaphysics, right, or higher order metaphysics for say there's two schools.
No such thing.
Well,
there's no such thing as metaphysics. There's no meta to metaphysics, because metaphysics is defined as to encompass things, because there's only one level in which you can differentiate concepts. There's two aspects, mind and matter. So there's only really one mental concept.
Right. Okay. So I was looking at I was going to push back on that same definition, but you clarified it in the single output to my question. So thank you.
It's the same. I mean, the thing is that there are some of these words that you put together that do make sense, but I want to make sure they keep making sense. And the way I've defined it, because it's always the standard of parsimony, you're only making the necessary number of metas. So there is no necessary meta to metaphysics, because it's definitionally meant to encompass the process of metastasizing. Does that make sense?
Define metastasizing in this context. Define metastasizing in this context.
Creating things meta to itself. So it is non-trivial to define something called metaphysics because of the mentalist origin. So metaphysics is basically another way of saying mentalism, because you're coming back to the dual aspects. You have the mental aspect and the material aspect. So you have the physical and the metaphysical. There's no third aspect. And that's something that is specific to my metaphysics, because my metaphysics are reverse engineered on the basis of parsimony.
Okay, right. So that's my first of three questions. But I'm curious now. So like we mentioned mind and matter as essentially this is not the second question. This is just a follow-up. What you'd refer to mind and matter as a dual aspect relation, correct? It's not dualism, but it appears as dualism on some level of realization or lack thereof, right?
Did you get to the point, I am going to answer, but did you get to the point in the convo with T-Jump where we actually got into the technical specifics of the non-dualism?
To be honest with you, I skimmed through that and got about 5 minutes worth of content. I did not watch that in its entirety.
Yeah, I understand that there weren't that many gold nuggets. So I just put in the image thread. Mm-hmm. It's dual aspect non-dualism.
Right,
so
right.
Your ultimate ontology is non-dualism. And then once you come out of non-dualism into the world of appearances, it's a dual aspect.
Okay, so now I'm not going to put labor on this discussion to discuss things like HF8, hyperbolic figure 8 complement, or QMPT, but I want to get to my second question. It's more in alignment with the flavor of my series that we made together. So if you don't mind, this question should be super helpful, I think. Tell me why interference is important for perception, and what does interference imply I guess, in day-to-day living?
Interference is like a fulcrum of perception, because the interference is happening in the sense organ, or the interference is facilitated by the sense organ. So you think of light coming in through the eyes. What are the eyes doing? It's essentially a collimator. So that's imposing a degree of locality upon a signal that was previously less localized. It was more localized than other signals, but it hadn't yet been funneled into your own eyes. That's an interferential event, but it's actually not really an interferential event.
Right.
It just sort of depends how you define interference. And I'm saying we should define interference as an observable change of state to the quality of the signal. So the interference would be happening in the eyes, and it would create a subset in some way that was consistent with its own measurement device. And then the observation event would happen again. So it's a question of what is the interference actually doing? So you can think of consciousness as rendered as a result of a sequence of these biological interferometer type arrays that start with the sense organs and then work their way in through what are called the schrotas, which are the pathways of body.
Right. So this is what I wanted to mention is this rendering aspect. What would you say to people who have a different, based on their ontology, they have a different perspective? Like they would infer based on their empirical, based on their phenomenology, I guess, or their empiricism, their direct empiricism, that it's not necessarily rendering the reality, but it's consciousness is being channeled like a radio wave, or it's being, we've talked about in Gus's model, generative modeling, or that
I seem to remember you using the term transceiver.
Yeah.
I think that's fairly accurate.
Yeah. I mean, would you be willing to, do you play with this idea that depending on somebody's, because this is my framework, not to politically use some political sleight of hand here, but in my framework of ontic flexibility, depending on which ontology you choose, it sets up your prior ledger, it sets up your logic ledger, and then you have a different kind of not only conception of how consciousness is behaving, or the properties of consciousness based on your ontology. For example, like I would argue a solipsist does render, right? A monist might render, or just experience. I don't know what the right word is. Hey, I'm kind of bastardizing the conversation now, so maybe you can save me.
No, you're doing a good job. You're doing a good job, and I get what you're alluding to. So I'll put a question to you, like, do you see what I mean when I say there's no such thing as an internal critique?
I think so. Any general critique?
Well, based on your reasoning, it's not possible to identify with somebody else's process of thinking.
Yeah, I guess I used to be, and when I was studying neuroscience 10 or 11 years ago, I was an identity theorist, like believing that the mind was literally the brain. But then as I spoke to you and we talked about like cortical, like drug-induced amplification or yoga-induced amplification of consciousness, where the amplifier is the brain, that started to help me kind of convince me that, hey, there's a set of other ontologies here that, do give rise to dual aspect non-dualism as something that is sort of self-evident, right?
Yeah, that's what I would argue, that once you see what the argument is saying, it becomes irrefutable. Like, yeah, of course I'm an interferometer for consciousness. That's the best explanation. But to actually get to that point where you're analogizing your own evolving perception in the universe is the thing most people can't get to, because it's too much of a conceptual leap. So I'm not sure if I'd answered your question, but please reiterate it, and I will get through the rest of the answer.
You answered my question. Let me double check. The only thing is, you answered it on the most fundamental level possible. I guess, Mike, the second part of that question was, what does it imply? And if you just entertain me for a second, I was talking more about relative situations or circumstances. So say you have two people who get into a fight, or two people who have just clicked together and have a great time. Neuroscientific empiricism already suggests the idea that there's some type of like EEG synchrony or oscillatory coupling going on between these people. And then spiritualists, or more like some other groups would say there's this consonance, or going back to even Alyssa's friend Ember, like this resonance mechanics that goes on where nodes can be in a state of consonance or a state of dissonance. To me, this sounds a lot like interference. Am I mischaracterizing interference here? Because it seems like it operates on all scales.
Yeah. You could think of interference as the metaphysical primitive, and then the duality of consonance and dissonance as like a yin-yang within that metaphysical primitive. Because interference doesn't give you direction. What a primitive is meant to do is give you a perceptual, like it's meant to analogize something already in your perception, so that its interpretation is completely unambiguous. So it's not that you can't prove metaphysical primitives or anything, but they should be something that gives you something to build on that's already in your intuition, so to speak.
All right, you ready for the final question?
Oh yeah.
Tell me why space-time is just an abstraction or abstracta.
Well, it's pretty much trivially true that anything conceptually coherent is, what did you call it, an abstracta?
Yeah.
Abstract is the singular of that abstractum, because that's a mouthful.
I don't know. I guess.
Can you just repeat the question? I was right. I want to write a few things down.
just say abstraction. Tell me why space-time is just an abstraction. I mean, and I'm convinced of this in my ontology. Like I would say it's just, you're just rendering this scenario, right? You're not actually, there's no bona fide, well, actually, I don't want to challenge you because I was about to say no bona fide 3+1, but that wouldn't make sense, right? There's definitely not a bona fide SO10.
3+1. So the thing is, we don't want our statements to be meaningless. So if I say, an assertion like something is an abstraction, then that's like by the two truths doctrine, it's trivially true, because anything that can be conceived of conventionally can't be absolutely true. So the only thing that's not an abstraction is the absolute truth, and the only thing that we can conceptualize conventionally are abstractions. That's just ontology. That's just a consequence of ontology. Does that make sense? Because I don't want to burst into a 10-minute soliloquy here if that doesn't track. So I'm just checking real quick.
No, it makes sense, but like you said, we were talking about, just entertain me for a second. I have it right here. It's in our ontological discussions page in the general. We were talking about superluminal information transfer, or taking a ship, through a wormhole or a warping of space-time, which is not precluded in your framework because information pre-exists space-time. And so just to support this for a second, in my own budding ontology, I would agree with you. The information of message passing and sending signals to and fro does not really presuppose any type of vectorization, right? So it's entangled, or you could argue even faster than entanglement, because apparently even entanglement has a speed limit, and I don't have speed limits in my ontology. That's still developing, but so do you know what I'm talking about, right?
More than one question. So
I was just using
I think it'd be more productive for me to answer the space-time as an abstraction question.
Yeah, that's my intention. Yep.
Okay, so I'll just come back to that. So building on the two truths doctrine as the starting point, that there are no non-abstractions in conventional language. So then we go to the next step of reasoning, which is we want the least abstract abstraction, basically. So what is the abstraction that is the one that's the highest up in the causal chain that we can identify?
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
So the answer to that is dual aspect non-dualism. And then that's the FIRO in the mental aspect. Did you see that diagram?
No.
I'm going to have to bring it up. So and then on the matter side, there's the usual 5: space, time, mass, charge, temperature. Okay, I'm going to put it in diagram images just so stuff stays organized, but it's the most recent one.
Okay. So
there's 4 aspects of mind and 5 aspects of matter. And the aspects of mind are focusing, isolating, rendering, and ordering. And then the aspects of space are given in terms of the aspects of time. And that's to demonstrate that the mental sub-aspects pre-exist the material ones. So even though in the diagram it's dual aspect, like two sides of a whole, technically the material side is a subset of the mental side. But because observationally what we have access to is material boundary, we look at them as dual aspects because all of our measurements are in the second aspect, the material sub-aspects. Did that make sense?
Yes.
So the reason I would say the space-time stuff is not really something that can be, quote, warped, is that if it's being warped by the mental sub-aspects. So you have to, if you want to modify matter, you need to modify it before it turns into matter. So when it's still in the purely mental state.
Okay, so this is enough good feed for the experimental metaphysics introduction, whether I make a tetralogy or just in the beginning of the final episode. So thank you very much, and yeah.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking the questions. It was fun to answer them.
Yep.